Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, RDA, Staff Training, Implementation, and Monographic Workflow. I'm Maria Pincus, member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for today's webinar. I'm delighted to present today's speaker, Stephen Smith. Stephen is the Acquisitions Librarian at the University of Illinois at Chicago and has been a cataloger and catalog manager for more than 2 decades. He has trained and mentored more than 50 library school graduate assistants as catalogers and has taught numerous workshops on descriptive cataloging, and authority control for library staff across the state of Illinois. Stephen produced an electronic interactive tutorial on authority control for the Illinois OCLC Users Group, which won the Leda Library High Tech Award in 2002. If you have questions for Stephen, please type them into the question box on your screen, and he will do his best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. If he does not have time to address all of the questions, they will be answered offline and sent to you in an email after the presentation. Also, please note the session will be recorded, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a link to the recording. You will also receive a copy of the slides. If you're interested, the ALCTS CE Committee invites you to use the Twitter back channel on the screen to interact with other participants during this webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenter in the box provided for questions. Neither the presenter nor host will monitor Twitter. As I turn the presentation over to Stephen, there may be a slight delay. I'm asking, are you seeing anything on my screen?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm pleased to be able to talk to you today about resource description and access implementation and the staff training that is requisite to integrating RDA into your workflows. RDA is here, regardless of whether you consider it to be akin to the group of flying monkeys from the Wicked Old Witch of the West or a movement into a grand new age of vetted resource sharing. It is upon us. The semantic web cometh, albeit slowly perhaps, yet we had best do what we can to push our library data out to the web into the spaces of open access. New and better discovery systems are needed and are currently being researched and developed, but it is just as critical that the library community provide more and better metadata, much of which can be extracted from the rich MARC metadata, since it is the metadata itself which will drive these new discovery systems and thus determine their true usefulness. Discovery is inextricably interwoven with metadata. RDA provides a beginning set of steps and a framework for assisting with this movement of library data towards the semantic web. This webinar is not intended to be an RDA training session and is certainly not long enough to delve into all of the detailed concepts of the functional requirements for bibliographic records. We will not deal with serials nor special categories of materials. The webinar will be focused on describing an implementation of RDA at an academic library, primarily of a print monograph workflow, with practical tips for training, specifically non-librarian staff in the foundational concepts of RDA and FRBR, and training staff when you're the only trainer, when you don't have a team of trainers, when you are it. An implementation strategy that works, that can get your library up and running for a high volume of materials that you deal with on a daily basis. You don't want to train forever, but to begin to deploy workflows for your primary formats of materials in a relatively short period of time. To do that, you must train your copy catalogers to grasp the fundamentals of FRBR and the RDA rules to acquire the foundational building blocks so that they can do their work. Now, I must say here that I don't consider myself an expert on RDA per se, but I take comfort in a quote by Albert Einstein, who once said, "That's all any of us are, amateurs. We don't live long enough to be anything else." On the other hand, I do know a fair amount about strategy in implementing workflows and training. So the agenda is parsed into 4 component parts. We will begin with policy questions and outline the decisions that the University of Illinois at Chicago determined would be in the best interest of our users. Then I will highlight some strategies, tactics, and techniques that were adopted to accomplish our initial foundational training. Emphasis will also be placed on detailing the practical strategy for a lone institutional trainer that effectively brought about a successful integration of RDA into the monographic workflow that was developed, and some general as well as specific procedures that were incorporated. Next, we will look at some data that was used to measure the initial success of the training program and the integration of the new cataloging rules into our technical services workflows. Finally, where we plan to go from here. To my mind, this is one of the most simple yet eloquent statements about what the catalog should do for our users, and metadata is the key. As Chris Oliver notes, RDA's purpose is to support the production of robust or well-formed data that can be managed using both current technologies and newly emerging database structures and technologies of the future. Realize that the new rules and their application will not be fully functional until the technology and programming catches up. Nevertheless, it is important that we provide content and infrastructure in our catalogs now so that whenever we acquire an enhanced functioning discovery system, that system will be able to immediately exploit our work. It is priming the pump, or greasing the wheels, if you prefer to think of it in one of those terms. So if you've not yet integrated RDA into your workflows, are you feeling a little apprehensive? Ever feel like you are behind with RDA or FRBR concepts? Ever feel like it's a long, hard road to implement? Ever feel like you are being pushed forward and can't stop the RDA train? Or maybe that it's all just a bit too much. Well, I've been there. It can feel rather daunting, particularly if you find yourself, as I did, as the single trainer or coordinator at your institution. One solution, of course, is to start with a plan, a strategic plan. I would like you to remember what the highly successful comedienne Lucille Ball once said, "I'm not funny. What I am is brave." We can all be brave like Lucy and move forward into RDA implementation. The University of Illinois at Chicago Library, UIC, is comprised of a main library in Chicago together with 4 health science libraries in Chicago, Peoria, Rockford, and Urbana, Illinois. The technical services functions are primarily centralized within one department, Resource Acquisition and Management, responsible for the vast majority of cataloging duties across the system. The UIC Library contributes holdings data to both the OCLC and the National Library of Medicine databases. The library also contains significant holdings of federal and state government documents. There is currently 10 staff trained as copy catalogers within the RAM department in the main library who all report to the acquisitions librarian, which is me. The UIC Library incorporated the RDA cataloging rules into their technical services workflows, initially focusing on the print monograph workflow at the beginning of May of 2013. The decision to do so was based on a number of key factors, including the understanding that this new standard presented an opportunity to position library bibliographic data ever closer to being more accessible to greater numbers of people via the web, to provide for a more user-friendly structure, such as with natural language. The decision by the Library of Congress, as well as other national agencies, to adopt, together with a philosophical belief that a more flexible and robust data structure that provided for consistency in application could truly benefit our users both locally and worldwide. When the idea of a new cataloging code was first bounced around, I started out hating this stuff. I was not at all prepared for such a cultural change. I'd studied AACR2R laboriously in library school. I could quote that most infamous of rules, 21.1b2, enter a work emanating from one or more corporate bodies, and I was flat out against the entire notion of replacing the cataloging rules. But then I realized that I didn't really know much about FRBR and hadn't really given it a chance. So I did what all good librarians do, and I began to research the FRBR concepts and had a change of heart after delving into it. I decided to just dive in and plunge ahead and tackle it directly with exploration and study. It took me a long while, but it began to make a whole lot of sense. The notion of entities and their attributes and the relationships among those entities. Then when AACR3 began to percolate, I decided to volunteer to serve as a liaison on the CCDA committee, which was reviewing the early draft documents for AACR3. There were times in which the committee would get bogged down in such granular details that it seemed that we might never get to the next step. Although the code was eventually completely rewritten, together with a name change, I learned quite a bit about the international process, and I made some good friends among the people who organized information. But the point is that we did get past the roadblocks, and we now have a new code. We need to embrace it. It is good for our users. Every instruction in RDA relates back to the user and to the tasks that the user wants to accomplish. A number of significant factors pertain to an effective integration of these new cataloging rules. Does your ILS vendor intend to support the technical and content description of all types of resources and all types of content? Talk to your vendor. They should be supporting this initiative. RDA is not about creating records as with AACR2. RDA instructions are about data, data that can be encoded, stored, and used in new ways. As vendors go, so goes RDA. Realize then that in the current environment, the advantages of using RDA are a mixed bag of immediate and future benefits. Will you need to coordinate your decision-making within a consortium? If you are a member of a consortium, they may recommend that your institution continue to supply the General Material Designator, the GMD, in the 245 field, even though RDA omits the GMD. Some ILS systems may utilize the GMD so as to create a format facet option for non-print materials. Some changes to uniform title heading constructions could affect the order of title browse displays in the Opec. Agreeing to retain name access points that are authorized according to RDA might result in duplicate entries. The issue of RDA authorized name access points and authority control in general is a huge moving target as the national libraries convert their files with significant potential local impact. The bibliographic utilities, such as OCLC, must allow for compatibility within their systems, since not all libraries worldwide will accept RDA as an international standard. The multiple cultures of records that reside in these union catalogs will need to be able to coexist. Yet from the beginning there has been an awareness of the importance of compatibility between AACR2 and RDA data. Compatibility has translated into a long-term goal. Some local library factors include the impact on various workflows together with their costs. Will you accept AACR2 records or upgrade them to RDA? What will your copy cataloging standards be for RDA records? Will the overall quality of the record influence your decision-making regarding whether to accept a record regardless of the content standard? Will you plan to make your legacy AACR2 data more RDA-like? Will you accept hybrid records as is or re-describe them fully in RDA? What RDA enhancements are acceptable to you and which are not? How will hybrid records change your workflow through acquisitions and cataloging? And what automated processes need to be adjusted to accommodate RDA? Then again, How will you plan to update a massive number of authority records and their headings? Are you averse to having RDA headings in AACR2 records when you have an authority record? There are costs associated with training staff for RDA, including the granularity of that training. Should all staff receive the same level of training? What is appropriate? Will the library administration support this initiative as an investment? There may also be potential hidden costs, such as possible backlogs when staffing resources are thin, or attempting too much conversion with a limited staff. Each situation will be different. The technical services librarians at the UIC library created a policy document for the implementation of the new RDA rules. Consideration was given to some short and long-term goals, including the desire to get the catalogers up and going in a timely manner, focus on building towards a critical volume of records that would have significant long-term impact, and yet still provide some immediate value-added capacity for our users. At UIC, if a record is identified as an RDA construction, then the cataloger verifies LC core, RDA elements per format. The cataloger also added a GMD per our consortium recommendations, although this is no longer in effect. The decision was made for copy catalogers to create hybrid records, adding select RDA elements to AACR2 and pre-AACR2 records for all monographic workflows, whether manual or semi-automated, when those records required some form of manual editing. We came to learn that with our automated authority verification process, many of our batch processed records ended up needing to be touched, given the current ongoing transition to the new forms of author headings by the national libraries. UIC also continues to request from our vendors that they provide RDA records with a minimum of LC core elements. Additionally, UIC decided to accept all authorized headings, whether AACR2 or RDA constructions, allowing for transition time of all headings to the RDA construction via the national agencies. If you find yourself in the position of being the sole trainer at your institution for movement into adoption of RDA, and particularly for your copy cataloging unit, the following are some helpful tools and mechanisms to employ which were found to be successful at the UIC library. The foundational training program at UIC was specifically geared for copy catalogers at the staff level, although some librarians also attended the sessions. We focused and refocused on the primary idea that everything we were doing was all based on user needs. I cannot emphasize this enough. It gave the staff a conviction and a purpose. Promoting the user tasks, helping our users from the very beginning, was consistently voiced, and this key theme was reiterated each day of the training with some practical examples, such as the ending of abbreviations, which, by the way, the staff voted on overwhelmingly for. We tried to fold in as much interaction and discussion of the concepts as possible until we arrived as a team at a point of common understanding. The strategy for the training schedule was partly due to a lesson learned from the initial adopters. The adopters had all agreed that additional time analyzing the FRBR model would have been helpful. Some had only devoted 1.5 hours to FRBR. We decided to introduce FRBR over 2 morning sessions just before the weekend so that staff would have a break before learning RDA itself. We followed this with 4 morning sessions, generally 3.5 to 4 hours per day, on RDA beginning the following week, with plenty of referencing back to the FRBR concepts, showing records and pointing out which elements correlated with which marked fields and subfields, and identifying the consistency and continuity with the AACR2 rules. We began each session with a presentation of the day's concepts, followed by discussion of those concepts. Then we followed up with an all-team analysis of RDA records across our primary formats. And finally, with record creation and record enhancement across our primary formats in different sized teams. In addition, it was decided to introduce staff to the RDA toolkit for purposes of understanding how to efficiently navigate it as a reference tool, but not to require that they use it on a daily basis. It was further decided to create a set of 1-page procedural documents per format, as a set of reference guides at point of need, each based on technical services policy decisions. Single-page procedural documents were used in order to simplify. Personally, I found that as a solitary trainer in such an intense environment, I needed some additional support for myself. So I maintained a balance for myself as a lone trainer by referencing my Tai Chi practice. Remembering consciously some of the Tai Chi form names allowed me to viscerally carry that information in my gut. And that helped to carry me through when I might start feeling tired and we weren't done for the day yet. For example, when I got a little paranoid that something was not working out, I thought of the form, wave hands like clouds. While training copy catalogers for FRBR concepts, I would recall, step back and repulse monkey. Attempting to move seamlessly between AACR2 and RDA guidelines called to mind the form, snake creeps through grass. And when attempting to inspire others to maintain standards in cataloging with copy, I thought of cannon fist. It can be very helpful to find a mechanism like this for yourself. It might be anything, a visual image, a particular appealing sound, a scent of roses or lilacs, or a combination of things. Just be sure that it is something that is meaningful to you. This can help get you through when it gets difficult or stressful, or you are just growing tired. And training can be very tiring. As much as was practicable, veteran copy catalogers were paired with beginners in a peer-to-peer arrangement. From previous experience, I knew that the veterans would learn just as much, if not more, than their mentees by virtue of having to articulate the learned concept back to their mentees. It worked well both ways. Explanations were provided for complex concepts from multiple angles of view, akin to illuminating a cut diamond, seen from slightly different positions until the concepts were understood. If not understood, the trainer would repeat the explanation, often in greater detail. Training was consistent with our scope and purpose. Training for copy catalogers to grasp the fundamentals of FRBR and the new RDA rules, to acquire the foundational building blocks so that the catalogers could integrate these standards into their work. We wanted to begin to deploy the procedural workflows for our primary formats on May 1st, to be followed shortly with original cataloging on September 1st. Focus was on the functional coding and content changes to our primary formats that would add value to the user experience, adding additional elements that, in some instances, might not provide immediate assistance to the user, but that would be in place once the technology was available that could fully exploit these enhancements to the data. Some ground rules were set up at the start, including the trainer's right to end any monologue that threatened to go on and on and on. There was too much content to cover in a short period of time, and the trainer was determined that the team would stay on point. There was a decision made to provide enough training to get us going without getting entangled in edge or fringe issues. Training was also deliberately functional and practical, with as much hands-on and interactive teamwork as possible. Thus the focus on UIC's primary formats and on utilizing bibliographic records from our own catalog. Although we utilized presentations by other agencies to provide overviews of certain content, original documentation was created locally concerning our library-wide policy for RDA implementation, a general procedures document applicable to all formats of materials, specific procedural documents for each of our primary formats, which included print monographs, e-monographs, DVDs, CDs, maps, print serials, and e-serials, an explanation on FRBR Group 1 entities, and an explanation on FRBR entities, attributes, and relationships. Okay? Now I'm going to highlight some additional techniques and tactics from my own experience, which, when blended together, provide a powerful set of training tools. Some of these are borrowed from other models, and a few are repeated because I consider them that important. Assume nothing. If an introductory session, assume no knowledge. Utilize half-day sessions, and even better, morning half-day sessions when everyone is fresher. Bring to saturation point, but don't overkill in any session. Teach in layers, the layered approach, like an onion, peeling back in ever greater detail. Actively listening to trainee questions is different from simply hearing their questions. It is vital to listen to both the messages as well as the meta-messages. Ask yourself, what is it that they really want? Repeat the most salient points. Tell them what you are going to tell them. Then tell them. Then tell them what you just told them. Participation is vital. Actualize the team approach and share information. Everyone on the team needs the same information. Team teaching can be the most effective style for group learning in many situations. One-on-one instruction is most fruitful in other cases. But this is always based on the individual trainees and the content. Standardize your basic training so that everyone has the same foundational level from the beginning. Then provide customized one-on-one instruction. Again, the layered approach. Become aware of the plenitude of diverse learning styles, abstract to concrete, concrete to abstract, as well as mixtures of these. Provide mechanisms and opportunities for the different learning styles that you encounter locally so that everyone is optimized. Link different teaching styles based on both the trainees as well as the individual session content whenever this appears feasible. Keep a focus. Don't introduce extraneous concepts. Introduce only those concepts relevant to the subject at hand. Keep it simple. Be sure that everyone is speaking the same terminology. Provide concrete examples from the immediate local environment as often as possible. Use as many visual aids as possible to help concretize and reinforce the ideas. Remember to add a timely dash of humor. It breaks up the stress. Offer a learning session with impunity. Allow people to explore ideas and to make mistakes as a critical function in the learning process. Actively learn from your own teaching and training experiences. Ask yourself what was and was not effective. And learn to laugh about your own training mistakes during the session. Training and learning should be fun. Remember what Charlie Chaplin said, "A day without laughter is a day wasted." As the wizened old bibliographer and teacher Donald Crummell would say when lecturing, having borrowed from Groucho, "Wee!" These are rhetorical questions on the slides here. Now, FRBR is an entity relationship model. When teaching FRBR, it is critical to start and end with the user and the 4 user tasks, which are the things the user wants to do: find, identify, select, and obtain. Everyone is fairly clear on these user tasks. What is also readily understandable is the possibilities of the relationships between entities. What seems to be most confusing is the Group 1 entities themselves, which are the products of intellectual or artistic creation. There are 4 in hierarchical relationship: work, expression, manifestation, and item. I want to share with you a simplified explanation that I found was both intelligible and understandable to my staff when I presented this highly complex concept. The Group 1 entities are a combination of form and content in inverse relationship hierarchically, moving from work to item. Work is the most abstract entity. Work is the content, the ideas alone, but which can only be understood as existing in its relationship to some form of expression, of a text manuscript expression, or any other script expression. It lives on the abstract level of ideas which have somehow been structured in some way. The ideas have taken shape in someone's head. Expression is the often original notation record from whatever type of original script. It could be a single original text manuscript, a film script, a musical composition, an original painting, a ballet performance, a symphony performance, or a drama performance, etc. Note that an original script is often unique. However, a computer-generated text manuscript can be copied multiple times, and if the content does not change, all of the copies, for purposes of bibliographic control, will be considered as the same expression, not different expressions. Manifestation is generally the formal published recording, the formally published recording, both identified within a specific carrier or container, and able in most cases of being duplicated as a formal publication, as distinct from an expression. Item is the most fully concrete entity, but it carries the other three abstract entities within its concreteness. Recall Plato's idea of a chair. And as we know, an item usually corresponds to the informal notation of a copy. Though RDA builds on the principles and methods of its predecessor, AACR2, RDA is quite different because it is based on a theoretical framework. It is designed for the digital environment, and it has a broader scope than AACR2. Recollect, if you will, that RDA is an application of the FRBR and FRAD conceptual models, that it is a data content standard. RDA answers the question, what data should I record and how should I record it? One of the key goals for the development of RDA was to provide a consistent, flexible, and extensible framework for both the technical and content description of all types of resources and all types of content. In the current bibliographic environment, we continue to express RDA elements within records based on the MARC format. Until, as a community, we can move beyond the MARC format, we will continue to underutilize the data elements of RDA construction. Having said that, I think we should do what we can within our current environment as it makes sense to do. Here's where you can get your staff really ingesting these concepts with the real work of digging in. Here's where your staff start nurturing together. Training and workflow call to mind one occasion in a previous job I held when I was attempting to inspire my staff with a talk about our primary purpose as a cataloging unit. We had a huge load, cataloging 4,000 to 5,000 titles a month in multiple formats with a backlog at the time in the thousands. I was trying to get across why we took such pains to structure all the materials that were coming through for our users. So I began explaining some of our traditional functions and how the academies have always acquired or attempted to acquire the unique, the odd, the quaint, the depressing, sometimes the bizarre, the disturbing, the unknown, the eccentric. And then one of them piped up and quipped, "Yeah, and that's just the people." The UIC library is following LC core practice and the PCC guidelines for enhancing and editing non-RDA monograph records. For AACR2 records or pre-AACR2 records, we are adding RDA elements to create a hybrid record. We are not upgrading to RDA standard at this time. Some primary fields that we review for RDA elements. The 245 field. We transcribe all the multiple authors and other responsible persons listed on the title page in the Statement of Responsibility and add all authors and other responsible persons as access points. In the 250 field, we're transcribing the addition statement as found on the piece. This goes back to that principle of representation. What do you see? The 260 and the 264 fields. At this point in time, we are using the 260 field. We are not replacing the 260 field with the 264 field, but we are using the copyright symbol. This may involve resetting your preferences in your ILS. And we use place of publication not identified and publisher not identified in brackets rather than SL and SN, sine loco and sine nomine. In the 300 field, we are spelling out pages or unnumbered pages, illustrations, etc. We do not spell out CM. UIC leaves the CM as found, either with or without the period, since future machine processing may easily normalize all the records without further effort on our part. In general, if a particular change doesn't affect access, we consider it lower priority. and as well the 336 to 338 fields. We are adding these and including the subfields delimiter A and delimiter 2. We do not include subfield B. So for one example, for a text, the 336 field is listed as a text, the delimiter 2 of RDA content. The 337 field is listed as unmediated with the delimiter 2 RDA media, and the 338 field is listed as a volume with a delimiter 2 of RDA carrier. Notice here in our print monograph workflow that our cataloging workflow begins at the diamond figure in the center of the process depicted. Regardless of the type of monograph, with the exception of electronic books, this workflow splits off into two main streams depending upon the record construction encountered. Is it RDA standard or pre-RDA? If it is an RDA record construction, the cataloger verifies the content elements for accuracy and appropriateness, as well as for purposes of ongoing training. That is, we wanted our catalogers to look at all of these records, look at a grouping of records as a part of the repetition of their own training. In general, the cataloger would accept the records, but we have had to add certain fields because, as we know, everyone has, especially in this first year, has been adding records with various levels of robustness. The vast majority of our print firm orders are now outsourced and batch processed. Also, our approval slip orders and our approval book direct shipments. But with all the name access point conversions, we are now reviewing many of these records if we identify that some other editing to the record is needed. We verify the name access points for currency and add RDA elements, either to incomplete RDA records or selectively for hybrid records as needed. There is a small percentage of titles that are handled completely manually, such as rush items, faculty or student requests, materials for special collections, and the like. These receive the same bibliographic review as the outsourced and batch-loaded items. Government document materials, as well as DVDs and CDs, also receive similar bibliographic review with the additional fields added as required per their formats. Electronic books at UIC are primarily purchased in packages and take an automated batch route with minimal review. Individual electronic title purchases also are processed in small batch. We do not create hybrid records for our electronic books at this time. Training truly is a primary key for the widespread dispersion and acceptance of these new standards. UIC borrowed training materials from a number of agencies, then selected parts and customized others, which worked favorably to produce a synthetic training program specifically geared to our staff and their particular training needs. There is much training documentation freely and currently available. Don't waste your own time with recreating what is already out there. Help yourself. You'll be helping others. Some training techniques that worked very well were the use of repetition, approaching FRBR by starting out with the primary emphasis on the user tasks, demonstrating continuity with legacy records by continuous referencing back to AACR2 and its incorporated principles, analyzing concrete examples of RDA records from the UIC catalog for each format of material that is of critical mass to us, followed by synthesizing AACR2 records with the addition of RDA elements. Simply put, it is the idea of analysis first, then synthesis. The initial statistical output numbers suggest that the incorporation of the RDA rules into the UIC monographic workflows was reasonably successful, based on the timely efficiency with which the records were scrutinized, whether they were RDA standard records or AACR2 hybrid record constructions. Examining and correcting bibliographic copy for description and name headings averaged between 5 and 8.5 minutes. This timing, by the way, did not include subject analysis. And also suggestive is the numbers of titles added to the collection. Note that UIC had experienced a receipt of less than half of our records as RDA constructions at that time. We anticipated this number to grow as LC and other libraries produce. Our decision to add selected RDA elements, creating hybrid records, provides value-added content due to these current percentages. And there is, as yet, a conspicuous lack of any growing cataloging backlogs at UIC. These outputs point to a certain success of the foundational training program. Further longitudinal data will be collected in order to more specifically analyze effects of this integration over time. Due to restructuring of our acquisitions ledgers this past summer, which severely impacted our manual and automated monographic workflows, numbers from the past 6 months would have suggested a false skewing of the data. Now that the restructuring is finalized and the workflows are normalized once again, the library intends to compile additional data in the spring of 2014 towards a comparative longitudinal study of the effects of the RDA integration. Additional training will necessarily be ongoing, and questions will continue to arise as catalogers encounter the myriad variations in RDA constructions, just as they experienced with the different levels of completeness and interpretation when AACR2 became the standard. Following an additional period of time for catalogers to gain more experience, the UIC library may begin to utilize macros within the workflows on a more regularized basis. We use some of these macros currently intermittently. Introducing the rest of the library staff to the strengths and differences of RDA constructions, now that a slow build towards an inevitable critical mass can be expected in all library catalogs, will be forthcoming in the near future. In the near and middle terms, library catalogs will continue to display records of various legacy and current metadata cultures. Cultural change will occur like a slow spring thaw, with ice flows breaking against the banks of the river and heaving legacy chunks up and over. FRBR, particularly the Group 1 entities and their relationships, can initially seem like a daunting hurdle, but it can be made understandable given an appropriate training venue. And a large part of ongoing training will be staying up to date with the annual changes to RDA, currently to be released once a year every April. Those changes will appear in the online RDA toolkit. The UIC library will continue to refine its workflows for all formats as the new standards revise and grow. Rules, tools, and systems will continue to change, and thus must our methods, but it is helpful to recall that durable and sustainable access for the user remains our primary purpose. There are a number of advantages in using RDA. Unlike AACR2, RDA maps between specific user tasks and different elements of bibliographic and authority data. The recording of clear, unambiguous data can support improved search and navigation and improved displays of results. RDA allows for greater granularity and precision when recording data. RDA also encourages the recording of sufficient data to support more precise collocation. And RDA gives the cataloger concrete guidance to respond to the user's needs and to record data that matches the specific user tasks. As Chris Oliver notes, not all advantages will be immediately apparent on the first day of implementation. Implementation should be seen as a process that begins with the transition from AACR2 to RDA, fitting within the parameters of the current environment. But there will be changes from day one, and catalogers will be the first ones to benefit because they will start using the new logical and consistent standard, built on principles and theory, and aimed at improving resource discovery for the user. As the catalogers build the body of RDA data, users will start to see the benefits of a standard that puts their needs at the center. Adherence to these new standards of FRBR and RDA will be a critical and key component of outreach to those non-library communities who seek to organize their information for purposes of sharing and repurposing their data for the greater good. As RDA takes hold with increasingly widespread adoption, and as the technology and programming catch up with the flexibility allowed for by the FRBR concepts, the semantic web with its use of linked data grows one step closer to a realization of significant convergence with the metadata that libraries have consistently and faithfully provided for the past 150 plus years. And with that convergence, perhaps as a society, we are not only moving ever closer to equitable and immediate access to information, but also to that durable and sustainable access to information now and in time to come. I have provided a link here to 5 documents which you might find helpful. The monograph workflow graph shown earlier, a general copy cataloging procedures guide, the specific print monograph procedures guide, the specific DVD monograph procedures guide, and a compilation guide for adding the 336 to 338 field elements. I can tell you that my staff have found the 336 to 338 field element cheat sheet, as they sometimes refer to it, very valuable as an electronic source because they can just copy and paste. There is an extensive amount of available materials dealing with RDA. Just try a Google search. I've attempted to provide for you here a select set of resources that I personally have found helpful and in a very practical way. Chris Oliver's introductory guide, along with Magda L. Sherbini's implementation handbook, each serve as thorough foundations. 2 very useful articles with emphasis on copy cataloging with RDA are Joy Anholt and Richard Stewart's RDA Simplified, and Sevan McCutcheon's Designing Policy, both from 2012. Lastly, 3 online tools which I found invaluable for training materials include the North Carolina State University Library's RDA training website, Robert Maxwell's RDA training website, and OCLC's website, About RDA, which includes links to the Library of Congress RDA training materials, the Program for Cooperative Cataloging site, and ALA's training materials and webinars. I want to thank you all for your attendance and participation, and I hope this was helpful in describing how you can implement RDA with a strategy and a plan and with a purpose. And now, there should be time for questions. Please feel free to post your questions if you have not done so already. The software does not allow for attendees to see the questions, so I shall try to speak the questions as we go along here.
Please type in your questions if you have any, because there are none right now at the questions box, so feel free to do so.
The documents in the Google box should be available as of right now. And as I understand, the slides will also be available to each of you after the program ends. And so you will have an opportunity to see all of the links.
We have a few questions coming up now. The first one is, does your library display RDA elements in Opec?
Yes. We did have an issue earlier on as a consortium with the GM, with the 336 to 338 fields. We have a bolt-on to our ILS which required our adding, despite the fact that we had 336 to 338 fields, for adding the GMD for use as a facet indicator. But this is an open source bolt-on, and since that time our consortium has handled that, and so that is no longer a problem for us. But the majority of the RDA fields we are able to display in the OPAC. The technology, I will say, is and the programming is a bit behind. That is, it's all trying to catch up, and it seems to me that the vendors are in many cases struggling with their own R&D and how much they should devote to this kind of thing. I think there was quite a bit of hesitancy early on, not knowing exactly how RDA would take off. But I think since the LC adoption in the other national libraries in March of 2013, I think there's a general understanding that this is going to be something that they need to deal with. And so I think we can see improvements in various ways over this coming year. And I, for one, tend to agitate somewhat fairly heavily with my vendor just to keep the questions up on the board.
Another question is, how long did the initial RDA training for copy catalogers take in terms of number of hours?
We had a total of 6 days, morning sessions for each of these days. So again, we began with the FRBR concepts on a Thursday and Friday morning, sometimes running from 8 until noon or 8 until a little more of a stretch beyond noon. And I deliberately I wanted this to happen between 2 different weeks so that the folks would be able to go home and relax and ingest some of this before we actually hit the RDA training per se. So on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday mornings, we also had approximately 4 to 4.5 hour sessions dealing with the various components of RDA. We did not spend much time dealing with the RDA toolkit. And I will just say this as a matter of experience. I'm not sure of how many copy catalogers have ever been required at any institution I've either visited or worked at where they were required to crack AACR2. Most institutions have figured out some form of documentation that's been extracted from the rule books so that the catalogers can be as efficient as they possibly can be. So I will add that within the training we also had a couple of afternoons where people worked on some what I would call homework assignments, and these were done in either pairs or groups of 3 so that people could work with each other and bounce the ideas off of each other as they thought that they understood them. This is what I was referring to earlier as the team approach, or as a part of the team approach, where we also tried to pair a veteran cataloger, someone who'd been cataloging for 3 or more years, with some new catalogers. And we did have about half of our catalogers had only been cataloging for a year or less at the time that we implemented RDA. This is simply because of the turnover, a huge turnover in the library. So the total number of hours were roughly around 35 to 40.
There's a question of whether you spent any time on doing outreach or training on RDA for other library staff, I would think, besides the copy catalogers.
is that question for cataloging staff within the library? Is that the?
The question just says, did you do any outreach or training on RDA for other library staff?
Library staff in general. I have done some of that, department by department. I am planning to do a more formalized presentation, more library-wide, sometime in the near future here this spring. I think it's important for all library staff to have some understanding of these new rules because everyone is seeing some aspects of the records, despite your ILS system and how much it will incorporate. All staff are seeing some amount of the RDA elements within the catalogs. And I think it is very important that kind of training do go on. But I personally have tried to do this in smaller groups up to this point.
Could you tell us which ILS you use?
We use the Ex Libris Voyager system.
Does your library submit hybrid RDA records from your local system to OCLC?
Not at this time.
So, and I'm following up on this. So the editing you do it for your local catalog only? You don't do it in the OCLC records?
Correct. We're assuming that OCLC is trying to determine how they are going to go through and massage their own data. And so at this point in time, we're allowing the national libraries and the PCC libraries to take the lead on this kind of thing.
This is not a question, but this has been a wonderful webinar. I am very encouraged for working with RDA. So I think we can finish our question session, and there are a couple of them, 2 or 3 only. Yes?
If I may just briefly respond, thank you very much for the comment. One thing that I would like to impress upon all of these folks is the reason I showed the slide of the amount of time that it was taking for us. I was very concerned initially as to whether we would generate backlogs because of the additional workload. But I found that over that first period of time, just after the training, that was not the case. But I think part of that has to do with how you do implement your training and whether you do it as a team approach. But I think I can't guarantee anything, but I can say with fair assurance that if you follow some of these techniques and these tactics, that you can be just as successful.
Well, there are a few questions that have not been answered, but they will be answered later offline, and you will get we will get them an email. I want to thank Stephen for describing your RDA training workflow and providing such helpful strategies. So if I can see my screen now. May take a little bit. In the meantime, I want to thank you all the attendees as well. We hope you found today's session useful.
Thanks for attending, everyone.
You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions and return the form to us. The comments that are received are reviewed by the ALCTS committee and used to plan additional continuing education offerings. Information about all ALCTS webinars is featured on the ALCTS website, so you can follow the link on this slide. I've listed the next 3 webinars on the slide, which include our first ever webinar in Spanish. So if you know anybody who is a Spanish-speaking cataloger, let them know that we have one, and you can go to the link and find information on registering. We also have an e-forum on shared print repository scheduled for April, and multiple sessions of our Fundamentals of course series. Check the website for exact dates, as they are offered multiple times throughout the year. You can suggest a webinar topic or other continuing education idea through the link to the ALCTS webinar on the screen. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Kat Valick and Eva Sorrell for providing technical support for today's webinar. The colleagues on the CE Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee make it possible to present these webinars smoothly. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS continuing education offerings again in the future. Good afternoon.